I did let everyone know that I opened their mics, but everyone's on mute right now. So at the end, if people have questions, it's a smaller group for the 1 o'clock hour. We can have more of a discussion at the end. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and just let me know when you want me to move ahead to this
Okay.
next slide.
I'll certainly do it. Are you ready for me to begin, Suzanne?
Yeah, this is just a quick overview of Overwatch.
Yeah, so just so you know who is sponsoring these classes and doing this these presentations, it's Overwatch Managed Security. We make these classes available at no charge to our partners, and we do it so that we can help people understand more about security. There's a lot of training going on for people in security, but sometimes having people that are on the front lines of it and working in it every day, it helps to get a different perspective. I hope you learned something from what we talked about today, and I hope you'll look at what we do at Overwatch and how we do it. And going forward, I hope you'll give us a call and let some of our people give you a deep dive into some of the ways we serve the community. Let's go to the next slide, Suzanne.
Sounds good.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about two of my favorite subjects today, and that is vulnerability assessments and patch management. And I'm going to start off by saying something that I feel like is probably a pretty bold thing to say on a call like this, because I know we have MSPs and IT personnel, et cetera, on the call with an interest in cybersecurity. And I just want to say that if any MSP or any other IT service provider that's not providing vulnerability assessment and patch management for their customers, you have to consider you may not be protecting those customers as you should be. If you look at the statistics, and I won't bore you today with a bunch of statistics about breaches, et cetera, but if you look at those breaches that's happening, finding vulnerabilities, weighing the risk of those vulnerabilities, and getting those vulnerabilities patched is paramount to protecting someone's network. And if you are not offering these services already, I certainly want to encourage you to think about providing them. These are services that are not overly complicated to deliver, especially for people that are already in the IT or MSP space, and they're not very costly to get started with. There are tools that can be utilized, commercial tools that can be utilized that you pay on a monthly basis, and then there's open source tools that you can install on your own hardware and have the service be available for free. They all work well, and I highly recommend that you add this to your portfolio of services. It doesn't require a lot of special training or anything. I think anyone working in IT every day would be able to do this. Especially do it as a service instead of trying to sell a platform to all of your customers. Vulnerability assessments and patch management both they're not optional services anymore for customers. They are very much a requirement if you're going to protect a network today. And they're central to what's happening in the tech community or tech industry as we began to move away from the trust but verify security model, which has kind of left us in the in the situation that we're in with cybersecurity. And as we move more to a zero trust model, and an element of that zero trust model is a focus around network protection rather than detection. So we're moving toward protection and away from just detection. Then I'll just move to slide 3. So before we deep dive into the vulnerability assessment area, I want to, for a few minutes, just talk about risk assessment for a second. I say this over and over and over. I say it in just about every class that I've done through this series, that security is not about technology. It's about focusing on reducing risk. And I say that over and over and over. I hope you will make that your mantra as well. What we're trying to do is reduce risk. So, and the goals of risk assessments, not vulnerability assessment, but risk assessments, are to, find and identify all the actual and potential vulnerabilities that we possibly can, and then track where all the important data resides in the network. Look at how that's secured, and look at what the consequences would be if all that data was lost. Once you have a good sense of all those risk factors, then you can start looking at creating a risk score, and then start knocking those things off in terms of fixing or remediating them, starting with the highest risk first, so that you work your way down to an extremely secure network in the shortest amount of time possible. I often think of the relationship between risk management or risk assessment and vulnerability assessment, and then patching. These three things are interrelated, and I always think about it like this. A risk assessment is the diagnosis. A vulnerability assessment is the treatment plan, and patching is more often than not the actual cure. So these things are interrelated, and you really have to do all three to do it correctly. Let's go to slide 4, Suzanne. So who do you think should perform a vulnerability assessment? Well, I think MSPs are the most qualified people to do it. They're certainly most qualified to assess and remedy any kind of technology related risk. You're in there, you're doing it every day. You know your customers, their processes, etc. I think vulnerability assessment as a service is should be an extremely high priority, and it's an excellent opportunity for MSPs to get into. It doesn't require a lot of training, and it's not a high cost. You don't have to have a lot of high cost personnel. Every MSP that I've met certainly has enough cybersecurity knowledge to perform vulnerability assessments, and most of you are probably already doing patch management of some sort. The vulnerability management as a service really boils down to providing a comprehensive and scalable security for your customers, and by managing, monitoring configuration changes. That's what some of the things that a vulnerability management platform can do for you is, monitor configuration changes, see when patches were applied, what patches need to be applied, what vulnerabilities have been remediated, what vulnerabilities are still open, looking at things like the hardening of servers, and compliance with policies, etc. All these things address the security of all the assets in a network, all the devices, applications, all assets. Vulnerability assessments, in the past, or traditionally, I guess I should say, have been sold in a different way than and used in a different way than they are today. Many years ago, a vulnerability assessment was typically performed one time a year. In rare instances, we would see a customer want to do it quarterly. As technology has advanced and the tools have advanced, we now have the opportunity to perform what we call continuous assessment. And in a continuous assessment model, it's usually purchased on a subscription model by the MSP or by their end customer. And instead of one time a year, it's sitting there running. It could be running a little bit of the network. You could be assessing a little bit of the network every day, or the entire network every day, or just once a week, once a month, whatever a particular customer needs it to happen. And with cloud-based tools and automation, that's a lot easier to do than it was many years ago. To run a vulnerability scan, can be done in several different ways. You can put what I call a scan proxy agent on a device inside the network. And if you're doing an internal network scan, you can just connect to that client and then run a scan internally. There's 3 different types of scans. You can do an external scan, which is really just scanning the external facing IP address, or if it's a web server, it can get much deeper. It can check for like cross-site scripting and a lot of other vulnerabilities. And then besides the typical internal vulnerability scan, you can also do an authenticated vulnerability scan. And obviously, with the right credentials, you'll be able to get into more things and see more things and have a better, richer data set to work with to assess the risk. The vulnerability assessment itself is, you do it for 2 primary reasons. First being that it informs you and all the others on a technical team about what the exposures are in a network. Helps you find all those vulnerabilities. And the other good thing about vulnerability assessment platforms is I've not seen any today that don't do this. They actually provide guidance around a particular vulnerability on how to remediate it, what you should do to remove that risk, or remediate what damage that could happen with that risk. Vulnerability assessments really do reduce the risk of hackers being able to breach an organization's network, and it provides the IT teams or the MSPs with a lot better understanding of what their network assets are, what the vulnerabilities are, and what the overall risk to an organization is. This is a really good thing because as an MSP, it provides you with a tremendous opportunity for revenue, because if you know the risk is there and you go to your customer, 9 times out of 10, they're going to want you to do the work, and those are all billable hours. Using a continuous vulnerability assessment service is, not only gives you that data, it gives it to you in more of a real-time fashion, and you can easily rescan after you've patched things and see if anything was missed or anything like that. So I highly recommend the continuous approach to doing a vulnerability assessment. But at the end of the day, a vulnerability assessment is there to give you, the person on the front lines of taking care of a network, give you good intel. So a vulnerability platform will provide you with, everything from, what ports are open on a firewall to, ports open on other machine servers, etc. What operating systems are running, what versions of those operating systems, what applications. It identifies many applications, most of them do today. It can also provide you insight into the security around APIs as well. Now, again, performing a vulnerability scan is not all that difficult. There's dozens of platforms out there. Probably the two most popular would be Nessus or OpenBAS. They're both open source products, but yet well supported by the community and used in a lot of commercial, by a lot of commercial, security companies. And as like I say, it has a huge community, and the products are really kept up to date. One thing that, if you're not familiar with, that you'll hear and really need to know about when we're talking about vulnerability scans is CVEs, which CVE just stands for common vulnerabilities and exposures. And those are where people in the community around the world have identified that there's I won't say a flaw, but there's an anomaly in a file or something that could be breached or has been breached. So they report those. The community is really good, and manufacturers are becoming extremely better, since they get a lot of bad press if they don't. But they're out there trying to get that patch in place in those files as soon as possible. There's a lot of times where a CVE is posted in the morning, and there'll already be there'll already be a remedy for that available by the end of the day. Sometimes it may take a week or a couple of weeks, depending on what it is. Especially if you get into issues where things like processors and things like that need patches. But running a vulnerability assessment platform, what makes it so much easier today than it has been in the past is that they all you can set it for different times, but every few minutes, every hour, every 12 hours, every day, week, whatever you want to do, you can have that vulnerability platform pulling those CVEs in to keep them current, so that when you do the scan, it's looking for the most current threats or vulnerabilities. Probably a majority, I would say a majority of the MSPs and IT departments out there right now work with a third party to provide those assessments. In other words, someone else would own the infrastructure. The MSP or the IT teams could be as involved in that process or as uninvolved in that process as they would need to be. Excuse me. The benefit of that is typically those things are cloud-based, so you're not having to install them on your own systems. And some long ago we had to install the vulnerability programs on a piece of hardware that went inside the customer's network, which was not only not very cost efficient, but it required a lot of time and effort. And then we'd only do the scans once or twice a year, so we had to go back out and get those. It was not a very streamlined process. For the customers themselves, there's no reason for a vulnerability assessment to be, something that they should have to do themselves or a product that they should own themselves. It has always worked best as a service. A lot of times, people that do assessments for different compliance programs, et cetera, will provide those services. Companies like Overwatch provide those services, to MSPs on a wholesale basis, and a lot of other companies do that. And there's even some hosted ones that, for small networks, are even available for free. So what does a vulnerability scanner do? Well, first and foremost, it discovers all the assets on a network, which is not always an easy task, as everybody on this call would know. It finds them. It does an internal scan. It looks at all the IP ranges and the any data that it can to not only identify an endpoint, but glean what information it can from those endpoints. So it builds an inventory database, and that's useful because it gets compared against the last time that scan run, and therefore you can tell if something new has popped up on the network or something has gone away or something like that. It's a very important part of security today because the number of assets on a network have just exploded with, as we get deeper and deeper into the Internet of Things, and people are just running more servers and VMs and lots and lots of different devices on a network, and you've got iPhones and all sorts of mobile devices connecting, and video surveillance cameras that are part of the network now, and things like biometric door locks and things like that are actually tying into the network and authenticating through like Active Directory, et cetera. So all of those things have just, exploded the number of items that have to be addressed when you're trying to patch the holes in the ship while it's still sailing. So it's getting harder and harder just to keep up. It's really important to be able to do vulnerability assessments on a fairly short interval in between, because all of these devices are showing vulnerabilities. But beyond taking that inventory, a good vulnerability scanner can look into the operating systems. It can tell what the versions of those operating systems are. It can tell what ports are in use from the firewall or from the from other servers, etc. They work across all different types of operating systems, from Windows and Linux, SCO and Unix and Macs, etc. So there's a way to get that information from all the devices on the network. They also can provide insight into the security and the expiration and versions of different security encryptions and also different security certificates.
Hey, Stan, really
again,
quick, should we be moving slides?
Yes, I'm sorry. You should probably go to the next slide. If you're on the fourth slide, go to number 5.
Do you mind explaining what the upgrading Windows 14% means?
Oh, it's just showing that it's a long process to do updates where things have to be rebooted and things like that, and that will come into play as we move into different ways that files can be patched, etc.
Mm-hmm. And now we're on this line that says the vulnerability management lifecycle.
Yep, and that's what we're talking about right now. is just that life cycle of, how do we find the vulnerabilities, and how do we get them patched, and then how do we follow up on that, and how do we keep up with things that are changing on the network so we can get them included in the next risk assessment or vulnerability assessment, et cetera. Let's see, where was I? We were talking about, oh yeah. So hackers or cyber criminals, they take every advantage that they possibly can to infiltrate a network. They're always, they're trying to find weak passwords. For the most part, first and foremost thing that you would do if you were a hacker is you'd want to find some place with poor patch management and other lax security policies, et cetera, so that you can infiltrate that organization. One of the best ways that I've ever seen to protect sensitive data, which that would mean data that could be that if it was destroyed or made inaccessible could cripple the customer or company. But one of the best ways to protect sensitive data is actually through a vulnerability assessment and a risk assessment. Even the most secure IT infrastructures out there will always have some sort of hidden vulnerabilities, and we can deal with those as long as we're finding the ones with the most risk and getting them patched and or replaced or whatever has to happen as quickly as possible. Think about the risk factor. Anything with a 10, let's say, should be remedied first, and we'll worry about the ones that are at a risk level of 1 towards the end. And if you were to add up all of the risk factors, you can see exponentially how addressing the most severe ones up front reduce that risk score rapidly. Assessments on large networks, even well-run networks, can produce tens of thousands of vulnerabilities. I've never performed a assessment or scan on a network that I didn't find vulnerabilities. If you do continuous or short intervals in between, assessments, you'll be able to identify, all the known exposures before an attack happens rather than after. Again, we're moving toward protection rather than just detection. Having those regular vulnerability assessments can be augmented with penetration testing as well. And, those penetration testing probably doesn't need to happen more than once a year for most companies if they're keeping their vulnerability assessments up to date. But, providing both and following up on the things the vulnerabilities that they uncover that is the proper due diligence to protect someone or protect the network. So I'm going to move in now toward patch management, and we'll start with what's a patch? Well, it's just a tiny amount of software manipulation inside a file to close a it usually won't even change the size of a particular file. They're extremely small things that have to happen, or a certain library has to be replaced, or something like that. But it's not, these are not, they're not things that would take a long time to remedy. It's just that in a lot of instances in the past, and as we see today with Microsoft and Patch Tuesday, a lot of times you have to reboot after those patches have been applied. But you don't have to do that so much anymore. There are a lot of newer technologies within patch management that allow you to apply those patches, and actually, if there were to be a problem with getting that patch applied, if it were to, say, lock up the system or something like that, it'll actually revert back to the last known good file that's causing the interruption, and come right back up, so that it allows you to be able to do a lot of patching remotely without having to be on site. Patch management just boils down to a centralized platform that detects, downloads, installs, and reports on all the patches inside of the network. Again, it covers basically the same thing that a vulnerability assessment does. It covers the operating systems, anything like Windows or Unix, Linux, whatever. And then it also is also very necessary, and most of the patch programs will actually patch things like Adobe and Java, Microsoft Office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of applications are included in the patch management schemas today.
Can I interject here for a second and just kind of maybe ask if anybody has questions to kind of give you a break? Anybody have questions up until this point? You've covered a lot of ground in the last 35 minutes. Anybody have questions? Any slides to go back to? Okay.
Yeah, we've only probably got about 5 to 7 more minutes, and then we'll be able to open the floor up again for questions.
I guess
nobody has any for now. Okay. All right.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay. So again, just like vulnerability assessment, patch management as a service is an excellent opportunity for for MSPs or anyone working within IT as a service. It's again been made much simpler through technology and automation than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. Now you can even integrate vulnerability assessment platforms with patch management platforms, so that as the vulnerability scanner actually does the scan and finds an anomaly or something that needs to be patched, it can actually trigger the patch management system to go pull the patch or search for that patch, find it, and actually install it on the device as that whole process is going on, which is a tremendous breakthrough, and something that a lot of us have wanted for a really long time. Yeah, as getting closer to the end, I want to tell you about one other thing that's a new technology that's really helping in the whole world of patching as well, and that's micro patching. And micro patching differs from regular patching in that the patch itself is not in the file, but it is the actual. It's so tiny. It's just the bits of code that was changed in the file, and it can be pushed to the machine and loaded into memory, and replaces literally and replaces the code that needed to be fixed or changed or whatever, and it stays in memory either until the next your next scheduled patch day or or anything like that. If the machine is turned off, the tiny little file stays on the computer, and when the computer boots back up, that comes directly back into memory, and it continues to protect the device until a permanent patch or update to the file can take place. Micro patching is a fascinating field, and it's being integrated today into a lot of endpoint solutions, so that the endpoint solutions are have the ability to patch things as it understands the different things that are going on.
Hey, Stan,
That's the mm-hmm.
do companies offer both of these together, or are they offered from different companies when you're looking for vulnerability scanning and patch management? Is that typically something that's bundled together from same type of vendor? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, when the vendor is a service provider, it is. But there are a lot of companies that provide platforms for people to do vulnerability assessments, where they're just utilizing that vendor's platform. So when you're doing that, typically that vendor doesn't also offer patch management. Vulnerability assessment can run somewhat unattended because it doesn't require anything to be installed. Patch management, on the other hand, in order for that to work, has to have a client on every device. So, it's really apples and oranges. But every MSP that I know of that's actually providing one is providing the other. Most tools like Autotask and ConnectWise and things like that, the RMM tools and the PSAs have some capabilities to do patching. There are new patch tools out there that are much more sophisticated and automated than some of the tools that are built in, like into the RMM, et cetera.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. You wanted to ask another question?
No, all good. Thank you for that explanation.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. So one other area I want to touch on is, and it's just not to take you long, we'll have time for more questions and just open discussion. Patch management is a large piece of meeting compliance as well. So if I can't think of any type of industry, I can't think of any type of business or industry that doesn't have to meet some type of compliance. And patch management it could not be a part of some, but it is, of everyone that I can think of or remember, patch management is necessary to meet that compliance. So again, it goes back to the opportunity with those customers. They can make a choice not to patch something if they didn't have to meet compliance, but if they have to meet compliance, they're going to need the MSP and the MSP services. You think about doctors' offices and retail stores, and people having to meet HIPAA, or people having to meet PCI compliance, or privacy laws, and on and on and on. Patch management, because it's associated with vulnerabilities, is absolutely one of the things that has to be addressed to meet those compliance requirements. And auditors that address those different types of compliance will want to see evidence of those patches being applied, scans being done, et cetera. Even with PCI compliance, penetration tests, when you get to a certain size of or number of credit cards you process in a year, it's mandatory to have penetration tests, et cetera. And that leads into like the last subject, which is privacy laws. And we're seeing a tremendous number of states have privacy laws. That California has CCPA. Then New York has SHIELD Act, and so there's a ton of different states out there that are passing laws to making companies that collect data on individuals, privacy data like names and social security numbers and health data, et cetera. They have to be accountable for that, and accountable that they're keeping that secure, and make it available if someone wants to request it. That they would be required to provide that to them, as well as whoever else they have made that information available to. So patch management, as those programs become more commonplace and have more and more bite in how they're police, then patch management and vulnerability assessment as well will become even more important, and again opening up even more opportunities for MSPs. And with that, I'm gonna stop and let anybody have ask questions, or we can have an open discussion.